Chapter 36. The stinging bites, then the itching of the body lice, steadily grew worse. In the filth, the lice as well as the fleas had multiplied by the thousands until they swarmed all over the hold. They were worst wherever the body crevices held any hair. Kunta's armpits and around his photo felt as if they were on fire, and his free hand scratched steadily wherever his shackled hand couldn't reach. He kept having thoughts of springing up and running away. Then, a moment later, his eyes would fill with tears of frustration. Anger would rise in him, and he would fight it all back down until he felt again some kind of calm. The worst thing was that he couldn't move anywhere. He felt he wanted to bite through his chains. He decided that he must keep himself focused upon something, anything to occupy his mind or his hands, or else he would go mad, as some men in the hold seemed to have done already, judging from the things they cried out. By lying very still and listening to the breathing sounds of the men on either side of him, Kunta had long since learned to tell when either of them was asleep or awake. He concentrated now upon hearing farther away from him. With more and more practice at listening intently to repeated sounds, he discovered that his ears, after a while, could discern their location almost exactly. It was a peculiar sensation, almost as if his ears were serving for eyes. Now and then, among the groans and curses that filled the darkness, he heard the thump of a man's head against the planks he lay on, and there was another odd and monotonous noise. It would stop at intervals, then resume after a while. It sounded as if two pieces of metal were being rubbed hard together, and after hearing more of it, Kunta figured that someone was trying to wear the links of his chains apart. Kunta often heard, too, brief exclamations and janglings of chains as two men furiously fought, jerking their shackles against each other's ankles and wrists. Kunta had lost track of time. The urine, vomit, and feces that reeked everywhere around him had spread into a slick paste covering the hard planking of the long shelves on which they lay. Just when he had begun to think he couldn't stand it anymore, 8-2-Bob came down the hatchway, cursing loudly. Instead of the routine food container, they carried what seemed to be some kind of long-handled hose and 4 large tubs. And Kunta noticed with astonishment that they were not wearing any clothes at all. The naked 2-Bob almost immediately began vomiting worse than any of the others who had come before. In the glow of their lights, they all but sprang along the aisles in teams of 2, swiftly thrusting their hose up onto the shelves and scraping some of the mess into their tubs. As each tub was filled, the 2-Bob would drag it back along the aisle and go bumping it up the steps through the opened hatchway to empty it outside, and then they would return. The 2-Bob were gagging horribly by now, their faces contorted grotesquely, and their hairy, colorless bodies covered with blobs of the mess they were scraping off the shelves. But when they finished their job and were gone, there was no difference in the hot, awful, choking stench of the hold. The next time that more than the usual 4 2-Bob descended with their food tubs, Kunta guessed that there must be as many as 20 of them clumping down the hatch steps. He lay frozen. Turning his head this way and that, he could see small groups of 2-Bob posting themselves around the hold. Some carrying whips and guns, guarding others with lights upraised at the ends of each shelf of chained men. A knot of fear grew in Kunta's belly as he began hearing strange clicking sounds, then heavy rattlings. Then his shackled right ankle began jerking. With flashing terror, he realized that the 2-Bob were releasing him. Why? What terrible thing was going to happen now? He lay still, his right ankle no longer feeling the familiar weight of the chain, hearing all around the hold more clicking sounds and the rattling of chains being pulled. Then the two Bobs started shouting and lashing with their whips. Kunta knew that it meant for them to get down off their shelves. His cry of alarm joined a sudden bedlam of shrieks in different tongues as the men reared their bodies upward, heads thudding against the ceiling timbers. The whips lashed down amid screams of pain as one after another of men grew thumping down into the aisleways. Kunta and his Wolof shackle-mate hugged each other on the shelf as the searing blows jerked them convulsively back and forth. Then hands clamped roughly around their ankles and hauled them across the shelves, mushy filth, and into the tangle of other men in the aisleway, all of them howling under the two Bob whips. Wrenching and twisting in vain to escape the pain, he glimpsed shapes moving against the light of the opened hatchway. The two Bob were snatching men onto their feet, one pair after another, then beating and shoving them along, stumbling in the darkness, toward the hatchway's steps. Kunta's legs felt separated from the rest of his body as he went lurching alongside the Wolof, shackled by their wrists, naked, crusted with filth, begging not to be eaten. The first open daylight in nearly 15 days hit Kunta with the force of a hammer between his eyes. He reeled under the bursting pain, flinging his free hand up to cover his eyes. His bare feet told him that whatever they were walking on was moving slightly from side to side. Fumbling blindly ahead, with even his cupped hand and clamped eyelids admitting some tormenting light, trying futilely to breathe through nostrils nearly plugged with snot, he gaped open his cracked lips and took a deep breath of sea air, the first of his life. His lungs convulsed from its rich cleanness, and he crumpled to the deck, vomiting alongside his shackle-mate. Lashes meeting flesh, and shrieks of pain amid two Bob shouts and curses, and strange flapping sounds overhead. When another whip ripped across his back, Kunta shrank to one side, hearing his Wolof partner gasp as the lash hit him. It kept tearing at them both until somehow they stumbled to their feet. He slit his eyes to see if he could escape some of the blows. But new pains stabbed into his head as their tormentors shoved them toward where Kunta could see the blurred forms of other two Bob, passing a length of chain through the shackles around each man's ankles. There had been more of them down there in the darkness than he had ever realized, and far more two Bob than had ever gone below. In the bright sunlight, they looked even paler and more horrible, their faces pitted with the holes of disease, their peculiar long hair in colors of yellow or black or red, some of them even with hair around their mouths and under their chins. Some were bony, others fat. Some had ugly scars from knives, or a hand, eye, or limb missing, and the backs of many were crisscrossed with deep scars. It flashed through Kunta's mind how his teeth had been counted and inspected, for several of these two Bob he saw had but few teeth. Many of them were spaced along the rails, holding whips, long knives, or some kind of heavy metal slick with a hole in the end, and Kunta could see beyond them an amazing sight, an unbelievable endlessness of rolling blue water. He jerked his head upward toward the slapping sounds above and saw that they came from giant white cloths billowing among huge poles and many ropes. The cloths seemed to be filled up with the wind. Turning about, Kunta saw that a high barricade of bamboo taller than any man extended completely across the width of the huge canoe. Showing through the barricade's center was the gaping black mouth of a huge, terrible-looking metal thing with a long, thick, hollow shaft, and the tips of more metal sticks like the ones the two Bob had been holding at the rail. Both the huge thing and the sticks were pointed toward where he and the other naked men were grouped. As their ankle shackles were being linked onto the new chain, Kunta got the chance to take a good look at his Wolof shacklemate for the first time. Like himself, the man was crusted from head to foot with filth. He seemed about the reins of Kunta's father, Amoro, and the Wolof had that tribe's classic facial features, and he was very black of color. The Wolof's back was bleeding from where the whippings had cut into him, and pus was oozing from where an LL mark had been burned into his back. Kunta realized, as their eyes searched each other, that the Wolof was staring at him with the same astonishment. Amid the commotion, they had time to stare also at the other naked men, most of them gibbering in their terror. From the different facial features, tribal tattoos, and scarification marks, Kunta could tell that some were Fula, Jola, Serere, and Wolof like his partner, but most were Mandinkas, and there were some he could not be sure of. With excitement, Kunta saw the one he was sure must have killed the slatee. He was indeed a Fula. Blood from the beating he had received was crusted all over him. They were all soon being shoved and whipped toward where another chain of 10 men was being doused with buckets of seawater drawn up from over the side. Then other Tubob with long-handled brushes were scrubbing the screaming men. Kunta screamed too as the drenching salt water hit him, stinging like fire in his own bleeding whip cuts and the burned place on his back. He cried even louder as the stiff brush bristles not only loosened and scraped off some of his body's crusted filth, but also tore open his scabbed lash cuts. He saw the water frothing and pinkish at their feet. Then they were herded back toward the center of the deck, where they flopped down in a huddle. Kunta gawked upward to see Tubob springing about on the poles like monkeys, pulling at the many ropes among the great white cloths. Even in Kunta's shock, the heat of the sun felt warm and good, and he felt an incredible sense of relief that his skin was freed of some of its filth. A sudden chorus of cries brought the chained men jerking upright. About 20 women, most of them teenaged, and 4 children came running naked and without chains from behind the barricade, ahead of 2 grinning Tubob with whips. Kunta instantly recognized the girls who had been brought on board with him. As with flooding rage, he watched all of the Tubob leering at their nakedness, some of them even rubbing their photos. By sheer force of will, he fought the urge to go lunging after the nearest Tubob despite their weapons. Hands clutched into fists, he sucked hard for air to keep breathing, wrenching his eyes away from the terrified women. Then a Tubob near the rail began pulling out and pushing in between his hands some peculiar folding thing that made a wheezing sound. Another joined in, beating on a drum from Africa, as other Tubob now moved themselves into a ragged line with the naked men, women, and children staring at them. The Tubob in the line had a length of rope, and each of them looped one ankle within it, as if that rope was a length of chain such as linked the naked men. Smiling now, they began jumping up and down together in short hops, keeping in time with the drum beats and the wheezing thing. Then they and the other armed Tubob gestured for the men in chains to jump in the same manner, but when the chained men continued to stand as if petrified, the Tubob's grins became scowls, and they began laying about with whips. "Jump!" shouted the oldest woman suddenly in Mandinka. She was of about the reins of Kunta's mother, Binta. Bounding out, she began jumping herself. "Jump!" she cried shrilly again, glaring at the girls and children, and they jumped as she did. "Jump to kill Tubob!" she shrieked, her quick eyes flashing at the naked men, her arms and hands darting at the movements of the warrior's dance. And then, as her meaning sank home, one after another shackled pair of men began a weak, stumbling hopping up and down, their chains clanking against the deck. With his head down, Kunta saw the welter of hopping feet and legs, feeling his own legs rubbery under him as his breath came in gasps. Then the singing of the woman was joined by the girls. It was a happy sound, but the words they sang told how these horrible Toubab had taken every woman into the dark corners of the canoe each night and used them like dogs. "Toubab fa! Kill Toubab!" they shrieked, with smiles and laughter. The naked, jumping men joined in. "Toubab fa!" Even the Toubab were grinning now, some of them clapping their hands with pleasure. But Kunta's knees began to buckle beneath him, and his throat went tight when he saw, approaching him, the short, stocky Toubab with white hair, and with him the huge, scowling one with the knife-scarred face, who also had been at that place where Kunta was examined and beaten and choked and burned before he was brought here. In an instant, as the other naked people saw these two, a sudden silence fell, and the only sound to be heard was that of great slapping cloths overhead, for even the rest of the Toubab had stiffened at their presence. Barking out something hoarsely, the huge one cleared the other Toubab away from the chained people. From his belt there dangled a large ring of the slender, shiny things that Kunta had glimpsed others using as they had opened the chains. And then the white-haired one went moving among the naked people, peering closely at their bodies. Wherever he saw whip cuts badly festered, or pus draining from rat bites or burned places, he smeared on some grease from a can that the huge one handed to him. Or the huge one himself would sprinkle a yellowish powder from a container on wrists and ankles that became a sickly, moist, grayish color beneath the iron cuffs. As the two Toubab moved nearer to him, Kunta shrank in fear and fury, but then the white-haired one was smearing grease on his festering places, and the huge one was sprinkling his ankles and wrists with the yellowish powder, neither of them seeming even to recognize who Kunta was. Then suddenly, amid rising shouts among the Toubab, one of the girls who had been brought with Kunta was springing wildly between frantic guards. As several of them went clutching and diving for her, she hurled herself screaming over the rail and went plunging downward. In the great shouting commotion, the white-haired Toubab and the huge one snatched up whips and with bitter curses lashed the backs of those who had gone sprawling after, letting her slip from their grasp. Then the Toubab up among the cloths were yelling and pointing toward the water. Turning in that direction, the naked people saw the girl bobbing in the waves, and not far away, a pair of dark fins coursing swiftly toward her. Then came another scream, a blood-chilling one, then a frothing and thrashing, and she was dragged from sight, leaving behind only a redness in the water where she had been. For the first time, no whips fell as the chained people, sick with horror, were herded back into the dark hold and rechained into their places. Kunta's head was reeling. After the fresh air of the ocean, the stench smelled even worse than before, and after the daylight, the hold seemed even darker. When soon a new disturbance arose, seeming somewhat distant, his practiced ears told him that the Toubab were driving up onto the deck the terrified men from the level below. After a while, he heard near his right ear a low mutter, "Jula?" Kunta's heart leapt. He knew very little of the Wolof tongue, but he did know that Wolof and some others used the word Jula to mean travelers and traders who were usually Mandinkas. And twisting his head a bit closer to the Wolof's ear, Kunta whispered, "Jula, Mandinka." For moments, as he lay tensely, the Wolof made no return sound. It went flashing through Kunta's head that if he could only speak many languages as his father's brothers did. But he was ashamed to have brought them to this place, even in his thoughts. "Wolof, Jabu Manga," the other man whispered finally, and Kunta knew that was his name. "Kunta Kinti," he whispered back. Exchanging a whisper now and then in their desperation to communicate, they picked at each other's minds to learn a new word here, another there, in their respective tongues. It was much as they had learned their early words as first Kafo children. During one of the intervals of silence between them, Kunta remembered how, when he had been a lookout against the baboons in the groundnut fields at night, the distant fire of a Fulani herdsman had given him a sense of comfort, and he had wished that there had been some way he could exchange words with this man he had never seen. It was as if that wish were being realized now, except that it was with a Wolof, unseen for the weeks they had been lying there shackled to each other. Every Wolof expression Kunta had ever heard he now dragged from his memory. He knew that the Wolof was doing the same with Mandinka words, of which he knew more than Kunta knew of Wolof words. In another time of silence between them, Kunta sensed that the man who lay on his other side, who never had made any sound other than moaning in pain, was listening closely to them. Kunta realized from the low murmuring that spread gradually throughout the hold that once the men had actually been able to see each other up in the daylight, he and his own shacklemate weren't the only ones trying now to communicate with one another. The murmuring kept spreading. The hold would fall silent now only when the Tubob came with the food tub, or with the brushes to clean the filth from the shelves. And there was a new quality to the quietness that would fall at these times. For the first time since they had been captured and thrown in chains, it was as if there was among the men a sense of being together. Chapter 37. The next time the men were taken up onto the deck, Kunta made a point of looking at the man behind him in line, the one who lay beside him to the left when they were below. He was a Sereri tribesman, much older than Kunta, and his body front and back was creased with whip cuts, some of them so deep and festering that Kunta felt badly for having wished sometimes that he might strike the man in the darkness for moaning so steadily in his pain. Staring back at Kunta, the Sereri's dark eyes were full of fury and defiance. A whip lashed out even as they stood looking at each other, this time at Kunta, spurring him to move ahead. The force of the blow drove him nearly to his knees and triggered an explosion of rage. With his throat ripping out almost an animal's cry, Kunta lunged off balance toward the Tubob, only to fall, sprawling, dragging his shacklemate down with him, as the Tubob nimbly sprang clear of them both. Men milled around them as the Tubob, his eyes narrowing with hatred, brought the whip down over and over on both Kunta and the Wolof, like a slashing knife. Trying to roll away, Kunta was kicked heavily in his ribs, but somehow he and the gasping Wolof managed to stagger back up among the other men from their shelf who were shambling toward their dousing with buckets of seawater. A moment later, the stinging saltiness of it was burning in Kunta's wounds, and his screams joined those of others over the sound of the drum and the wheezing thing that had again begun marking time for the chained men to jump and dance for the Tubob. Kunta and the Wolof were so weak from their new beating that twice they stumbled, but whip blows and kicks sent them hopping clumsily up and down in their chains. So great was his fury that Kunta was barely aware of the women singing Tubob Fa. And when he had finally been chained back down in his place in the dark hold, his heart throbbed with a lust to murder Tubob. Every few days the 8 naked Tubob would again come into the stinking darkness and scrape their tubs full of the excrement that had accumulated on the shelves where the chained men lay. Kunta would lie still with his eyes staring balefully in hatred, following the bobbing orange lights, listening to the Tubob cursing and sometimes slipping and falling into the slickness underfoot, so plentiful now, because of the increasing looseness of the men's bowels, that the filth had begun to drop off the edges of the shelves down into the aisleway. The last time they were on deck, Kunta had noticed a man limping on a badly infected leg. The chief Tubob had applied grease to it, but it hadn't helped, and the man had begun to scream horribly in the darkness of the hold. When they next went on deck, he had to be helped up, and Kunta saw that the leg, which had been grayish before, had begun to rot and stink even in the fresh air. This time the man was kept up on deck when the rest were taken back below. A few days later, the women told the other prisoners in their singing that the man's leg had been cut off, and that one of the women had been brought to tend him, but that the man had died that night and been thrown over the side. Starting then, when the Tubob came to clean the shelves, they also dropped red-hot pieces of metal into pails of strong vinegar. The clouds of acrid steam left the hold smelling better, but soon it would again be overwhelmed by the choking stink. It was a smell that Kunta felt would never leave his lungs and skin. The steady murmuring that went on in the hold whenever the Tubob were gone kept growing in volume and intensity as the men began to communicate better and better with one another. Words not understood were whispered from mouth to ear along the shelves until someone who knew more than one tongue would send back their meanings. In the process, all of the men along each shelf learned new words in tongues they had not spoken before. Sometimes men jerked upward, bumping their heads in the double excitement of communicating with each other and the fact that it was being done without the Tubob's knowledge. Muttering among themselves for hours, the men developed a deepening sense of intrigue and of brotherhood. Though they were of different villages and tribes, the feeling grew that they were not from different peoples or places. When the Tubob next came to drive them up onto the deck, the chained men marched as if they were on parade. And when they descended again, several of those men who spoke several tongues managed to change their position in line in order to get chained at the ends of the shelves, thus permitting more rapid relaying of translations. The Tubob never seemed to notice, for they were either unable or unconcerned to distinguish one chained man from another. Questions and responses to them had begun spreading in the hold. "Where are we being taken?" That brought a babble of bitterness. "Whoever returned to tell us?" Because they were eaten. The question, "How long have we been here?" brought a rash of guesses of up to a moon, until the question was translated to a man who had been able to keep account of daylights through a small air vent near where he was chained. He said that he counted 18 days since the great canoe had sailed. Because of intrusions by Tubob with their food tub or their scrapers, an entire day might be used up in relaying of responses to a single statement or question. Anxious inquiries were passed along for men who might know each other. "Is anyone here from Barakunda village?" someone asked one day, and after a time there came winging back from mouth to ear the joyous response, "I, Jabon Sallah, am here." One day, Kunta nearly burst with excitement when the Wolof hastily whispered, "Is anyone here from Jafur village?" "Yes, Kunta Kinti," he sent back breathlessly. He lay almost afraid to breathe for the hour that it took an answer to return. Yes, that was the name. I heard the drums of his grieving village. Kunta dissolved into sobs, his mind streaming with pictures of his family around a flapping white cockerel that died on its back as the village Wadanila went to spread that sad news among all of the people who would then come to Amaro. Binta, Lamin, Suwadu, and the baby Madi, all of them squatting about and weeping as the village drums beat out the words to inform whoever might hear them far away that a son of the village named Kunta Kinti now was considered gone forever. Days of talking sought answers to the question, how could the Tubob of this canoe be attacked and killed? Did anyone have or know anything that might be used as weapons? None did. Up on the deck, had anyone noticed any carelessness or weaknesses on the part of the Tubob that could be useful to a surprise attack? Again, none had. The most useful information of any sort had come from the women singing as the men danced in their chains, that about 30 Tubob were riding with them on this big canoe. There had seemed to be many more, but the women were in a better position to count them. The women said also that there had been more Tubob at the beginning of the voyage, but 5 had died. They had been sewn inside white cloths and thrown overboard while the white-haired chief Tubob read from some kind of book. The women also sang that the Tubob often fought and beat each other viciously, usually as a result of arguments over which ones would next use the women. Thanks to their singing, not much happened up on the deck that wasn't quickly told to the men dancing in their chains, who then lay discussing it down in the hold. Then came the exciting new development that contact had been established with the men who were chained on the level yet below. Silence would fall in the hold where Kunta lay, and a question would be called out from near the hatchway. How many are down there? And after a time the answer would circulate to Kunta's level. We believe about 60 of us. The relaying of any information from whatever source seemed about the only function that would justify their staying alive. When there was no news, the men would talk of their families, their villages, their professions, their farms, their hunts. And more frequently there arose disagreements about how to kill the Tubob and when it should be tried. Some of the men felt that, whatever the consequences, the Tubob should be attacked the next time they were taken up on deck. Others felt that it would be wiser to watch and wait for the best moment bitter disagreements began to flare up. One debate was suddenly interrupted when the voice of an elder rang out, "Hear me, though we are of different tribes and tongues. Remember that we are the same people. We must be as one village, together in this place." Murmurings of approval spread swiftly within the hold. That voice had been heard before, giving counsel in times of special stress. It was a voice with experience and authority as well as wisdom. Soon the information passed from mouth to ear that the speaker had been the alcalá of his village. After some time he spoke again, saying now that some leader must be found and agreed upon, and some attack plan must be proposed and agreed upon before there could be any hope of overcoming the Tubob, who were obviously both well organized and heavily armed. Again, the hold soon filled with mutterings of approval. The new and comforting sense of closeness with the other men made Kunta feel almost less aware of the stink and filth, and even the lice and rats. Then he heard the new fear that was circulating, that yet another Slatey was believed to be somewhere on the level of men below. One of the women had sung of having been among the group of chained people whom this Slatey had helped to bring, blindfolded, onto this canoe. She had sung that it was night when her blindfold was removed, but she had seen the Tubob give that Slatey liquor, which he drank until he stumbled about drunkenly. And then the Tubob, all howling with laughter, had knocked him unconscious and dragged him into the hold. The woman sang that though she was not able to tell in any definite way the face of that Slatey, he was almost surely somewhere below in chains like the rest, in terror that he would be discovered and killed, as he now knew that one Slatey had already. In the hold, the men discussed how probably this Slatey, too, was able to speak some Tubob words, and in hopes of saving his miserable life, he might try to warn the Tubob of any attack plans he learned of. It occurred to Kunta as he shook his shackles at a fat rat, why he had known little of Slateys until now. It was because none of them would dare to live among people in villages, where even a strong suspicion of who they were would bring about their instant death. He remembered that back in Jaffur he often had felt that his own father Amoro and yet older men, when they sat around the night fires, would seem to be needlessly occupied with dark worries and gloomy speculations about dangers to which he and the other young men privately thought they themselves would never succumb. But now he understood why the older men had worried about the safety of the village. They had known better than he how many Slatees slithered about, many of them in the Gambia. The despised tan-colored Sasso-Boro children of Tubob fathers were easy to identify, but not all. Kunta thought about how the girl of his village who had been kidnapped by Tubob and then escaped, who had gone to the Council of Elders just before he had been taken away, wanting to know what to do about her Sasso-Boro infant, and he wondered what the Council of Elders had decided for her to do. Some few Slatees, he learned now from the talk in the hold, only supplied Tubob canoes with such goods as indigo, gold, and elephant's teeth. But there were hundreds of others who helped Tubob to burn villages and capture people. Some of the men told how children were enticed with slices of sugar cane, then bags were thrown over their heads. Others said the Slatees had beaten them mercilessly during the marches after their capture. One man's wife, big with child, had died on the road. The wounded son of another was left bleeding to die from whip cuts. The more Kunta heard, the more his rage became as great for others as for himself. He lay there in the darkness, hearing the voice of his father sternly warning him and Lamin never to wander off anywhere alone. Kunta desperately wished that he had heeded his father's warnings. His heart sank with the thought that he would never again be able to listen to his father, that for the rest of whatever was going to be his life, he was going to have to think for himself. All things are the will of Allah. That statement, which had begun with the Alcala, went from mouth to ear, and when it came to Kunta from the man lying on his left side, he turned his head to whisper the words to his Wolof shacklemate. After a moment, Kunta realized that the Wolof hadn't whispered the words on to the next man, and after wondering for a while why not, he thought that perhaps he hadn't said them clearly, so he started to whisper the message once again. But abruptly the Wolof spat out loudly enough to be heard across the entire hold. "If your Allah wills this, give me the devil." From elsewhere in the darkness came several loud exclamations of agreement with the Wolof, and arguments broke out here and there. Kunta was deeply shaken. The shocked realization that he lay with a pagan burned into his brain, faith in Allah being as precious to him as life itself. Until now he had respected the friendship and the wise opinions of his older shacklemate. But now Kunta knew that there could never be any more companionship between them. Are you enjoying this reading so far? Welcome to Right Here Audio, the group run by students for students who wish they had someone to read academic literature to them. We read content for anyone who has a hard time reading by themselves. This includes persons with blindness, dyslexia, ADHD, and anyone else who could use some support. Do you have anything you would like us to read for you? Comment down below and we'll get started. For those of you who have supported us since day one, we are so grateful for your support. And if you're new or haven't subscribed yet, join our small community dedicated to increasing accessibility one small step at a time. Now, let's get back to our reading. Chapter 38. Up on the deck now, the women sang of having managed to steal and hide a few knives, and some other things that could be used as weapons. Down in the hold, even more strongly than before, the men separated into two camps of opinion. The leader of the group that felt the Tubob should be attacked without delay was a fierce-looking, tattooed Wolof. On the deck, every man had seen him dancing wildly in his chains while baring his sharply filed teeth at the Tubob, who clapped for him because they thought he was grinning. Those who believed in the wisdom of further watchful preparation were led by the tawny Fula, who had been beaten for choking the Slatey to death. There were a few followers of the Wolof who exclaimed that the Tubob should be attacked when many of them were in the hold, where the chained men could see better than they and the element of surprise would be greatest. But those who urged this plan were dismissed as foolish by the others, who pointed out that the bulk of the Tubob would still be up on the deck, and thus able to kill the chained men below like so many rats. Sometimes when the arguments between the Wolof and the Fula would reach the point of shouting, the Alcala would intervene, commanding them to be quieter lest their discussion be overheard by the Tubob. Whichever leader's thinking finally prevailed, Kunta was ready to fight to the death. Dying held no fear for him anymore. Once he had decided that he would never see his family and home again, he felt the same as dead already. His only fear now was that he might die without at least one of the Tubob also dead by his hand. But the leader toward whom Kunta was most inclined, along with most of the men, he felt, was the cautious, whip-scarred Fula. Kunta had found out by now that most of the men in the hold were Mandinkas, and every Mandinka knew well that the Fula people were known for spending years, even their entire lives if need be, to avenge with death any serious wrong ever done to them. If someone killed a Fula and escaped, the Fula's sons would never rest until one day they found and killed the murderer. "We must be as one behind the leader we agree upon," the Alcala counseled. There was angry muttering from those who followed the Wolof, but then it had become clear that most of the men sided with the Fula. He promptly issued his first order. "We must examine Tubob's every action with the eyes of hawks, and when the time comes, we must be warriors." He advised them to follow the counsel of the woman who had told them to look happy when they jumped on their deck in their chains. That would relax the Tubob's guard, which would make them easier to take by surprise. And the Fula also said that every man should locate with his eyes any weapon-like object that he could swiftly grab and use. Kunta was very pleased with himself, for during his times up on deck he had already spotted a spike tied loosely beneath a space of railing, which he intended to snatch and use as a spear, to plunge into the nearest Tubob belly. His fingers would clutch around the handle he imagined in his hands every time he thought of it. Whenever the Tubob would jerk the hatch cover open and climb down among them, shouting and wielding their whips, Kunta lay as still as a forest animal. He thought of what the Kintango had said during manhood training, that the hunter should learn from what Allah himself had taught the animals, how to hide and watch the hunters who sought to kill them. Kunta had lain for hours thinking how the Tubob seemed to enjoy causing pain. He remembered with loathing the times when Tubob would laugh as they lashed the men, particularly those whose bodies were covered with bad sores, and then disgustedly wipe off the ooze that splattered onto them. Kunta lay also bitterly picturing the Tubob in his mind as they forced the women into the canoe's dark corners in the nights. He imagined that he could hear the women screaming. Did the Tubob have no women of their own? Was that why they went like dogs after others' women? The Tubob seemed to respect nothing at all. They seemed to have no gods, not even any spirits to worship. The only thing that could take Kunta's mind off the Tubob and how to kill them was the rats, which had become bolder and bolder with each passing day. Their nose whiskers would tickle between Kunta's legs as they went to bite a sore that was bleeding or running with pus. But the lice preferred to bite him on the face, and they would suck at the liquids in the corners of Kunta's eyes or the snot draining from his nostrils. He would squirm his body, with his fingers darting and pinching to crush any lice that he might trap between his nails. But worse even than the lice and rats was the pain in Kunta's shoulders, elbows, and hips, stinging now like fire from the weeks of steady rubbing against the hard, rough boards beneath him. He had seen the raw patches on other men when they were on deck, and his own cries joined theirs whenever the big canoe pitched or rolled somewhat more than usual. And Kunta had seen that when they were up on the deck, some of the men had begun to act as if they were zombies. Their faces wore a look that said that they were no longer afraid, because they no longer cared whether they lived or died. Even when the whips of the two-bob lashed them, they would react only slowly. When they had been scrubbed of their filth, some were simply unable even to try jumping in their chains, and the white-haired Chief Two-Bob, with a look of worry, would order the others to permit those men to sit, which they did with their foreheads between their knees, and the thin pinkish fluid draining from their raw backs. Then the Chief Two-Bob would force their heads backward, and into their upturned mouths pour some stuff that they would usually choke up. And some of them fell limply on their sides, unable to move, and Two-Bob would carry them back into the hold. Even before these men died, which most of them did, Kunta knew that in some way they had willed themselves to die. But in obedience to the Fula, Kunta and most of the men tried to keep acting happy as they danced in their chains, although the effort was like a canker in their souls. It was possible to see, though, that when the two-bob were thus made more relaxed, fewer whips fell on backs, and the men were allowed to remain on the sunlit deck for longer periods than before. After enduring the buckets of seawater and the torture of the scrubbing brushes, Kunta and the rest of the men sat resting on their haunches and watched the two-bob's every move, how they generally spaced themselves along the rails, how they usually kept their weapons too close to be grabbed away. No chained man's eye missed it whenever any two-bob leaned his gun briefly against the rails. While they sat on the deck, anticipating the day when they would kill the two-bob, Kunta worried about the big metal thing that showed through the barricade. He knew that at whatever cost in lives, that weapon would have to be overwhelmed and taken, for even though he didn't know exactly what it was, he knew that it was capable of some terrible act of destruction, which was of course why the two-bob had placed it there. He worried also about those few two-bob who were always turning the wheel of the big canoe, a little this way, a little that way, while staring at a round brownish metal thing before them. Once, when they were down in the hold, the alcala spoke his own thought. If those two-bob are killed, who will run this canoe? And the Fula leader responded that those two-bob needed to be taken alive. With spears at their throats, he said, they will return us to our land, or they will die. The very thought that he might actually see his land, his home, his family once again sent a shiver down Kunta's spine. But even if that should happen, he thought he would have to live to be very old if he was ever to forget, even a little bit, what the two-bob had done to him. There was yet another fear within Kunta, that the two-bob might have the eyes to notice how differently he and the other men danced in their chains on the deck, for now they were really dancing. They couldn't help their movements from showing what was deep in their minds, swift gestures of hurling off shackles and chains, then clubbing, strangling, spearing, and killing. While they were dancing, Kunta and the other men would even whoop out hoarsely their anticipation of slaughter. But to his great relief, when the dancing ended and he could again contain himself, he saw that the unsuspecting two-bob only grinned with happiness. Then one day up on the deck, the chained people suddenly stood rooted in astonishment and stared, a along with the Tubob, at a flight of hundreds of flying fish that filled the air above the water like silvery birds. Kunta was watching, dumbfounded, when suddenly he heard a scream. Whirling, he saw the fierce, tattooed Wolof in the act of snatching a metal stick from a Tubob. Swinging it like a club, he sent the Tubob's brains spraying onto the deck. As other Tubobs snapped from their frozen positions of shock, he battered another to the deck. It was done so swiftly that the Wolof, bellowing in rage, was clubbing his fifth Tubob when the flash of a long knife lopped off his head cleanly at the shoulders. His head hit the deck before his body had crumpled down, and both spurted blood from their stumps. The eyes in the face were still open, and they looked very surprised. Amid shoutings of panic, more and more Tubobs scrambled to the scene, rushing out of doors and sliding like monkeys down from among the billowing white cloths. As the women shrieked, the shackled men huddled together in a circle. The metal sticks barked flame and smoke. Then the big black barrel exploded with a thunderous roar and a gushing cloud of heat and smoke just over their heads, and they screamed and sprawled over each other in horror. From behind the barricade bolted the chief Tubob and his scar-faced mate, both of them screaming in rage. The huge one struck the nearest Tubob with a blow that sent blood spurting from his mouth. Then all of the other Tubob were a mass of screaming and shouting as with their lashes and knives and fire sticks they rushed to herd the shackled men back toward the opened hatch. Kunta moved, not feeling the lashes that struck him, still awaiting the Fulah's signal to attack. But almost before he realized it, they were below and chained back in their dark places, and the hatch cover had been slammed down. But they were not alone. In the commotion, a Tubob had been trapped down there with them. He dashed this way and that in the darkness, stumbling and bumping into the shelves, screaming in terror, scrambling up when he fell and dashing off again. His howling sounded like some primeval beast's. "Tubob fa!" somebody shouted, and other voices joined him. "Tubob fa! Tubob fa!" they shouted louder and louder, as more and more men joined the chorus. It was as if the Tubob knew they meant it for him, and pleading sounds came from him as Kunta lay silent as if frozen, none of his muscles able to move. His head was pounding, his body poured out sweat, he was gasping to breathe. Suddenly the hatch cover was snatched open, and a dozen Tubob came pounding down the stairs into the dark hold. Some of their whips had slashed down onto the trapped Tubob before he could make them realize he was one of them. Then, under viciously lashing whips, the men were again unchained and beaten, kicked back up onto the deck, where they were made to watch as 4 Tubob with heavy whips beat and cut into a pulpy mess the headless body of the Wolof. The chained men's naked bodies shone with sweat and blood from their cuts and sores, but scarcely a sound came from among them. Every one of the Tubob was heavily armed now, and murderous rage was upon their faces as they stood in a surrounding ring, glaring and breathing heavily. Then the whips lashed down again as the naked men were beaten back down into the hold and rechained in their places. For a long while no one dared even to whisper. Among the torrent of thoughts and emotions that assailed Kunta when his terror had subsided enough for him to think at all, was the feeling that he wasn't alone in admiring the courage of the Wolof, who had died as a warrior was supposed to. He remembered his own tingling anticipation that the Fulah leader would at any instant signal an attack, but that signal hadn't come. Kunta was bitter, for whatever might have happened would have been all over now, and why not die now? What better time was going to come? Was there any reason to keep hanging on to life here in this stinking darkness? He wished desperately that he could communicate as he once did with his shacklemate, but the Wolof was a pagan. Mutterings of anger at the Fulah's failure to act were cut short by his dramatic message. The attack, he announced, would come the next time the men on their level of the hold were on deck being washed and jumping in their chains, when the Tubob seemed most relaxed. "Many among us will die," the Fulah said, "as our brother has died for us. But our brothers below will avenge us." There was grunting approval in the murmurings that circulated now, and Kunta lay in the darkness listening to the raspings of a stolen file rubbing against chains. He knew for weeks that the file marks had been carefully covered with filth so that the Tubob wouldn't see. He lay fixing in his mind the faces of those who turned the great wheel of the canoe, since their lives were the only ones to be spared. But during that long night in the hold, Kunta and the other men began to hear an odd new sound that they had never heard before. It seemed to be coming through the deck from over their heads. Silence fell rapidly in the hold, and, listening intently, Kunta guessed that stronger winds must be making the great white cloths flap much harder than usual. Soon there was another sound, as if rice was falling onto the deck. He guessed after a while that it must be rain pelting down. Then he was sure that he heard, unmistakably, the muffled crack and rumble of heavy thunder. Feet could be heard pounding on the deck overhead, and the big canoe began to pitch and shudder. Kunta's screams were joined by others as each movement up and down, or from side to side, sent the chained men's naked shoulders, elbows, and buttocks, already festered and bleeding, grinding down even harder against the rough boards beneath them, grating away still more of the soft, infected skin until the muscles underneath began rubbing against the boards. The hot, lancing pains that shot from head to foot almost blacked him out, and it was as if from afar that he became dimly aware of the sound of water pouring down into the hold, and of shrieks amid a bedlam of terror. The water poured more and more rapidly into the hold until Kunta heard the sound of something heavy, like some great coarse cloth, being dragged over the deck above. Moments later the flood subsided to a trickle, but then Kunta began to sweat and gag. The Tubob had covered the holes above them to shut out the water, but in so doing they had cut off all air from the outside, trapping the heat and stench entirely within the hold. It was beyond tolerance, and the men began to choke and vomit, rattling their shackles frantically and screaming in panic. Kunta's nose, throat, and then his lungs felt as if they were being stuffed with blazing cotton. He was gasping for more breath to scream with. Surrounded by the wild frenzy of jerking chains and suffocating cries, he didn't even know it when both his bladder and his bowels released themselves. Sledgehammer waves crashed on the hull, and the timbers behind their heads strained against the pegs that held them together. The choked screams of the men down in the hold grew louder when the great canoe plunged sickeningly downward, shuddering as tons of ocean poured across her. Then, miraculously, she rose again under the torrential rams that beat down on her like hailstones. As the next mountainous broadside drove her back down again and up again, heeling, rolling, trembling, the noise in the hold began to abate as more and more of the chained men fainted and went limp. When Kunta came to, he was up on deck, amazed to find himself still alive. The orange lights moving about made him think at first they were still below. Then he took a deep breath and realized it was fresh air. He lay sprawled on his back, which was exploding with pain so terrible that he couldn't stop crying, even in front of the Tubob. He saw them far overhead, ghostly in the moonlight, crawling along the cross arms of the tall, thick poles. They seemed to be trying to unroll the great white cloths. Then, turning his pounding head toward a loud noise, Kunta saw still more Tubobs stumbling up through the open hatchway, staggering as they dragged the limp, shackled forms of naked men up onto the deck of the canoe, dumping them down near Kunta and others already piled up like so many logs. Kunta's shackle-mate was trembling violently and gagging between moans, and Kunta's own gagging wouldn't stop as he watched the white-haired Chief Tubob and the huge scarred one shouting and cursing at the others, who were slipping and falling in the vomit underfoot, some of it their own, as they continued to drag up bodies from below. The great canoe was still pitching heavily, and a drenching spray now and then splashed over the quarter-deck. The Chief Tubob had difficulty keeping his balance, now moving hurriedly, as another Tubob followed him with a light. One or the other of them would turn upward the face of each limp, naked man, and the light would be held close. The Chief Tubob would peer closely, and sometimes he would put his fingers on one wrist of that shackled man. Sometimes, then, cursing bitterly, he would bark an order, and the other Tubob would lift and drop the man into the ocean. Kunta knew these men had died below. He asked himself how Allah, of whom it was said that he was in all places at all times, could possibly be here. Then he thought that even to question such a thing would make him no better than the pagan shuddering and moaning alongside him. And he turned his thoughts to prayer for the souls of the men who had been thrown over the side, joined already with their ancestors. He envied them. Chapter 39. By the time the dawn came, the weather had calmed and cleared, but the ship still rolled in heavy swells. Some of the men who still lay on their backs or on their sides showed almost no signs of life. Others were having dreadful convulsions, but along with most of the other men, Kunta had managed to get himself into a sitting position that relieved somewhat the horrible pains in his back and buttocks. He looked dully at the backs of those nearby. All were bleeding afresh through blood already dried and clotted, and he saw what seemed to be bones showing at the shoulders and elbows. With a vacant look in another direction, he could see a woman lying with her legs wide apart. Her private parts, turned in his direction, were smudged with some strange grayish-yellowish paste, and his nose picked up some indescribable smell that he knew must come from her. Now and then one of the men who were still lying down would try to raise himself up. Some would only fall back. But among those who succeeded in sitting up, Kunta noticed, was the Fula leader. He was bleeding heavily, and his expression was of one who wasn't part of what was going on around him. Kunta didn't recognize many of the other men he saw. He guessed that they must be from the level below his. These were the men whom the Fula had said would avenge the dead from the first level after the Tubob were attacked. The attack Kunta didn't have the strength even to think about anymore. In some of the faces around him, including that of the man he was shackled to, Kunta saw that death was etched. Without knowing why, he was sure they were going to die. The face of the Wolof was grayish in color, and each time he gasped to breathe, there was a bubbling sound in his nose. Even the Wolof's shoulder and elbow bones, which showed through the raw flesh, had a grayish look. Almost as if he knew that Kunta was looking at him, the Wolof's eyes fluttered open and looked back at Kunta, but without a sign of recognition. He was a pagan, but... Kunta extended a finger weakly to touch the Wolof on the arm, but there was no sign of any awareness of Kunta's gesture, or of how much it had meant. Although his pains didn't subside, the warm sun began to make Kunta feel a little better. He glanced down and saw, in a pool around where he sat, the blood that had drained from his back, and a shuddering whine forced itself up his throat. Tubob, who were also sick and weak, were moving about the brushes and buckets, scrubbing up vomit and feces, and others were bringing tubs of filth up from below and dumping it over the side. In the daylight, Kunta vacantly noted their pale, hairy skins and the smallness of their photos. After a while he smelled the steam of boiling vinegar and tar through the gratings as the chief Tubob began to move among the shackled people applying his salve. He would put a plaster of cloth smeared with powder wherever the bones showed through, but seeping blood soon made the plasters slip and fall off. He also opened some of the men's mouths, including Kunta's, and forced down their throats something from a black bottle. At sunset, those who were well enough were fed maize boiled with red palm oil and served in a small tub they dipped into with their hands. Then each of them had a scoopful of water brought by a Tubob from a barrel that was kept at the foot of the biggest of the poles on deck. By the time the stars came out, they were back below in chains. The emptied spaces on Kunta's level, where men had died, were filled with the sickest of men from the level below, and their moans of suffering were even louder than before. For 3 days Kunta lay among them in a twilight of pain, vomiting, and fever, his cries mingled with theirs. He was also among those racked with fits of deep, hoarse coughing. His neck was hot and swollen, and his entire body poured with sweat. He came out of his stupor only once, when he felt the whiskers of a rat brush along his hip. Almost by reflex his free hand darted out and trapped the rat's head and 4 parts in its grasp. He couldn't believe it. All the rage that had been bottled up in him for so long flooded down his arm and into his hand. Tighter and tighter he squeezed, the rat wriggling and squealing frantically, until he could feel the eyes popping out, the skull crunching under his thumb. Only then did the strength ebb from his fingers and the hand open to release the crushed remains. A day or 2 later, the chief Tubob began to enter the hold himself, discovering each time and unchaining at least one more lifeless body. Gagging in the stench, with others holding up lights for him to see by, he applied his salve and powder and forced the neck of his black bottle into the mouths of those still living. Kunta fought not to scream with pain whenever the fingers touched the grease to his back or the bottle to his lips. He also shrank from the touch of those pale hands against his skin. He would rather have felt the lash. And in the light's orange glow, the faces of the Tubob had a kind of paleness without features that he knew would never leave his mind any more than the stink in which he lay. Lying there in filth and fever, Kunta didn't know if they had been down in the belly of this canoe for 2 moons or 6 or even as long as a reign. The man who had been lying near the vent through which they had counted the days was dead now, and there was no longer any communication among those who had survived. Once when Kunta came jerking awake from a half-sleep, he felt a nameless terror and sensed that death was near him. Then, after a while, he realized that he could no longer hear the familiar wheezing of his shacklemate beside him. It was a long time before Kunta could bring himself to reach out a hand and touch the man's arm. He recoiled in horror, for it was cold and rigid. Kunta lay shuddering. Pagan or not, he and the Wolof had talked together, they had lain together, and now he was alone. When the Tubob came down again, bringing the boiled corn, Kunta cringed as their gagging and muttering came closer and closer. Then he felt one of them shaking the body of the Wolof and cursing. Then Kunta heard food being scraped as usual into his own pan, which was thrust up between him and the still Wolof, and the Tubob moved on down the shelf. However starved his belly was, Kunta couldn't think of eating. After a while, two Tubob came and unshackled the Wolof's ankle and wrist from Kunta's. Numb with shock, he listened as the body was dragged and bumped down the aisle and up the stairs. He wanted to shove himself away from that vacant space, but the instant he moved, the raking of his exposed muscles against the boards made him scream in agony. As he lay still, letting the pain subside, he could hear in his mind the death wailings of the women of the Wolof's village, mourning his death. "Tubob Fa!" he screamed into the stinking darkness, his cuffed hand jangling the chain of the Wolof's empty cuff. The next time he was up on deck, Kunta's glance met the gaze of one of the Tubob who had beaten him and the Wolof. For an instant they looked deeply into each other's eyes, and though the Tubob's face and eyes tightened with hatred, this time no whip fell upon Kunta's back. As Kunta was recovering from his surprise, he looked across the deck and for the first time since the storm saw the women. His heart sank. Of the original 20, only 12 remained, but he felt a pang of relief that all 4 of the children had survived. There was no scrubbing this time. The wounds on the men's back were too bad, and they jumped in their chains only weakly, this time to the beat of the drum alone. The Tubob who had squeezed the wheezing thing was gone. As well as they could in their pain, the women who were left sang that quite a few more Tubob had been sewn into white cloths and dropped overboard. With a great weariness in his face, the white-haired Tubob was moving among the naked people with his salve and bottle, when a man with the empty shackles of a dead partner dangling from his wrist and ankle bolted from where he stood and raced to the rail. He had scrambled halfway over it when one of the nearby Tubob managed to catch up with him and grab the trailing chain just as he leapt. An instant later his body was banging against the side of the great canoe, and the deck was ringing with his strangled howls. Suddenly, unmistakably, amid the cries, Kunta heard some Tubob words. A hissing rose from the chained men. It was the other slatee, without question, as the man flailed against the hull, screeching "Tubob Fa!" and then begging for mercy. The chief Tubob went over to the rail and looked down. After listening for a moment, he abruptly jerked the chain from the other Tubob and let the slatee drop screaming into the sea. Then, without a word, he went back to greasing and powdering wounds as if nothing had happened. Though their whips fell less often, the guards seemed to act terrified of their prisoners now. Each time the prisoners were brought up on deck, the Tubob ringed them closely, with fire sticks and knives drawn, as if at any moment the shackled people might attack. But as far as Kunta was concerned, though he despised the Tubob with all his being, he didn't care about killing them anymore. He was so sick and weak that he didn't even care if he lived or died himself. Up on the deck he would simply lie down on his side and close his eyes. Soon he would feel the chief Tubob's hands smearing salve on his back again, and then for a while he would feel nothing but the warmth of the sun and smell only the fresh ocean breeze, and then the pain would dissolve into a quiet haze of waiting, almost blissfully, to die and join his ancestors. Occasionally, down in the hold, Kunta would hear a little murmuring here and there, and he wondered what they could find to talk about. And what was the point? His Wolof shacklemate was gone, and death had taken some of those who had translated for the others. Besides, it took too much strength to talk anymore. Each day Kunta felt a little worse, and it didn't help to see what was happening to some of the other men. Their bowels had begun to drain out a mixture of clotted blood and thick, grayish-yellow, horribly foul-smelling mucus. When they first smelled and saw the putrid discharge, The two Bob became agitated. One of them went rushing back up through the hatch, and minutes later the chief two Bob descended. Gagging, he gestured sharply for the other two Bob to unshackle the screaming men and remove them from the hold. More two Bob soon returned with lights, hose, brushes, and buckets. Vomiting and gasping curses, they scraped, scrubbed, and scrubbed again the shelves from which sick men had been taken away. Then they poured boiling vinegar on those places and moved the men lying next to those places to other empty spaces farther away. But nothing helped, for the bloody contagion, which Kunta heard the two Bob called the flux, spread and spread. Soon he too began to writhe with pains in his head and back, and then to roast and shiver with fever and chills, and finally to feel his insides clenching and squeezing out the stinking blood and ooze. Feeling as if his entrails were coming out along with the discharge, Kunta nearly fainted from the pain. Between screams he cried out things he could hardly believe he was uttering. Omar the second Caliph, third after Muhammad the Prophet. Kairaba means peace. Finally his voice was all but gone from shrieking and could hardly be heard amid the sobbing of the others. Within 2 days the flux had afflicted nearly every man in the hold. By now the bloody globs were dripping down off the shelves into the aisleways, and there was no way for the two Bob to avoid brushing against it or stepping on it, cursing and vomiting, whenever they went into the hold. Each day now the men would be taken up on deck while the two Bob took down buckets of vinegar and tar to boil into steam to clean the hold. Kunta and his mates stumbled up through the hatch and across to where they would flop down on the deck, which would soon be fouled with the blood from their backs and the discharge from their bowels. The smell of the fresh air would seem to go all through Kunta's body, from his feet to his head, and then, when they were returned to the hold, the vinegar and tar smell would do the same, although the smell of it never killed the stench of the flux. In his delirium, Kunta saw flashing glimpses of his grandma Yaisa lying propped up on one arm on her bed, talking to him for the last time, when he was but a small boy, and he thought of old grandmother Nyoboto and the stories she would tell when he was back in the first kafo, about the crocodile who was caught in a trap by the river when the boy came along to set it free. Moaning and babbling, he would claw and kick when the two Bob came anywhere near him. Soon most of the men could no longer walk at all, and two Bob had to help them up onto the deck so that the white-haired one could apply his useless salve in the light of day. Every day someone died and was thrown overboard, including a few more of the women and 2 of the 4 children, as well as several of the two Bob themselves. Many of the surviving two Bob were hardly able to drag themselves around anymore, and one manned the big canoe's wheel while standing in a tub that would catch his flux mess. The nights and the days tumbled into one another until one day Kunta and the few others from below who could yet manage to drag themselves up the hatch steps stared over the rail with dull astonishment at a rolling carpet of gold-colored seaweed floating on the surface of the water as far as they could see. Kunta knew that the water couldn't continue forever, and now it seemed that the big canoe was about to go over the edge of the world, but he didn't really care. Deep within himself, he sensed that he was nearing the end. He was unsure only of by what means he was going to die. Dimly, he noted that the great white sheets were dropping, no longer full of wind as they had been. Up among the poles, the two Bob were pulling their maze of ropes to move the sheets this way and that, trying to pick up any little breeze. From the two Bob down on the deck, they drew up buckets of water and sloshed them against the great cloths. But still the great canoe remained becalmed, and gently it began to roll back and forth upon the swells. All the Tubob were on the edges of their tempers now, the white-haired one even shouting at his knife-scarred mate, who cursed and beat the lesser Tubob more than before, and they in turn fought with each other even more than they had before. But there were no further beatings of the shackled people, except on rare occasions, and they began to spend almost all the daylight hours up on deck, and, to Kunta's amazement, they were given a full pint of water every day. When they were taken up from the hold one morning, the men saw hundreds of flying fish piled up on the deck. The women saying that the Tubob had set lights out on deck the night before to lure them, and they had flown aboard and floundered about in vain trying to escape. That night they were boiled with the maize, and the taste of fresh fish startled Kunta with pleasure. He wolfed the food down, bones and all. When the stinging yellow powder was sprinkled next against Kunta's back, the chief Tubob applied a thick cloth bandage against his right shoulder. Kunta knew that meant his bone had begun showing through, as was the case with so many other men already, especially the thinner ones, who had the least muscle over their bones. The bandaging made Kunta's shoulder hurt even more than before, but he hadn't been back down in the hold for long before the seeping blood made the soaked bandage slip loose. It didn't matter. Sometimes his mind would dwell on the horrors he had been through, or on his deep loathing of all Tubob, but mostly he just lay in the stinking darkness, eyes gummy with some yellowish matter, hardly aware that he was still alive. He heard other men crying out, or beseeching Allah to save them, but he neither knew nor cared who they were. He would drift off into fitful, moaning sleep, with jumbled dreams of working in the fields back in Jafur, of leafy green farms, of fish leaping from the glassy surface of the Bolong, of fat antelope haunches roasting over glowing coals, of gourds of steaming tea sweetened with honey. Then, drifting again into wakefulness, he sometimes heard himself mouthing bitter, incoherent threats and begging aloud, against his will, for a last look at his family. Each of them, Omoro, Binta, Lamin, Suwadu, Mahdi, was a stone in his heart. It tortured him to think that he had caused them grief. Finally, he would wrench his mind away to something else, but it wouldn't help. His thoughts would always drift to something like the drum he had been going to make for himself. He'd think about how he would have practiced on it at night while guarding the groundnut fields, where no one could hear his mistakes. But then he would remember the day he had gone to chop down the tree trunk for the drum, and it would all come flooding back. Among the men who were still alive, Kunta was one of the last who were able to climb down unassisted from their shelf and up the steps to the deck. But then his wasting legs began trembling and buckling under him, and finally he too had to be half carried and half dragged to the deck. Moaning quietly with his head between his knees, rheumy eyes clamped tight, he sat limply until his turn came to be cleaned. The Tubob now used a large soapy sponge lest a hard bristled brush do further damage to the men's gouged and bleeding backs. But Kunta was still better off than most, who were able only to lie on their sides, seeming almost as if they had stopped breathing. Among them all, only the remaining women and children were reasonably healthy. They hadn't been shackled and chained down within the darkness, filth, stench, lice, fleas, rats, and contagion. The oldest of the surviving women, one of about Binta's reigns, Mbuto was her name, a Mandinka of the village of Kirawan, had such stateliness and dignity that even in her nakedness it was as if she wore a robe. The Tubob didn't even stop her from moving with comforting words among the shackled men lying sick on the deck, rubbing fevered chests and foreheads. "Mother, mother," Kunta whispered when he felt her soothing hands, and another man, too weak to speak, just gaped his jaws in an attempt to smile. Finally, Kunta could no longer even eat without help. The draining shreds of muscle in his shoulders and elbows refused to lift his hands enough for him to claw into the food pan. Often now the feeding was done with the men up on deck, and one day Kunta's fingernails were scrabbling to get up over the edges of the pan when the scar-faced Tubob noticed it. He barked an order at one of the lesser Tubob, who proceeded to force into Kunta's mouth a hollow tube and pour the gruel through it. Gagging on the tube, Kunta gulped and slobbered the food down, then sprawled out on his belly. The days were growing hotter, and even up on the deck everyone was sweltering in the still air. But after a few more days, Kunta began to feel a breath of cooling breeze. The big cloths up on the tall poles started to snap again, and soon were billowing in the wind. The Tubob up above were springing about like monkeys again, and soon the big canoe was cutting through the water with froth curling at her bow. The next morning, more Tubob than usual came thudding down through the hatch, and much earlier than ever before. With great excitement in their words and movements, they rushed along the aisles, unchaining the men and hurriedly helping them upward. Stumbling up through the hatch behind a number who were ahead of him, Kunta blinked in the early morning light and then saw the other Tubob and the women and children standing at the rails. The Tubob were all laughing, cheering, gesturing wildly. Between the scabbed backs of the other men, Kunta squinted and then saw. Though still blurred in the distance, it was unmistakably some piece of Allah's earth. These Tubob really did have some place to put their feet upon, the land of Tubabo-Do, which the ancient forefathers said stretched from the sunrise to the sunset. Kunta's whole body shook. The sweat came popping out and glistened on his forehead. The voyage was over. He had lived through it all. But his tears soon flooded the shoreline into a gray swimming mist, for Kunta knew that whatever came next was going to be yet worse. Chapter 40. Back down in the darkness of the hold, the chained men were too afraid to open their mouths. In the silence, Kunta could hear the ship's timbers creaking, the muted sss of the sea against the hull, and the dull clumpings of Tubob feet rushing about on the deck overhead. Suddenly some Mandinka began shrieking the praises of Allah, and soon all the others had joined his, until there was a bedlam of praise and praying and of chains being rattled with all the strength the men could muster. Amid the noise, Kunta didn't hear the hatch when it scraped open, but the jarring shaft of daylight stilled his tongue and jerked his head in that direction. Blinking his eyes to compress the mucus in them, he watched dimly as the Tubob entered with their lanterns and began to herd them, with unusual haste, back onto the deck. Wielding their long-handled brushes once again, the Tubob ignored the men's screams as they scrubbed the encrusted filth from their festering bodies, and the chief Tubob moved down the line sprinkling his yellow powder. But this time, where the muscles were rubbed through deeply, he signaled for his big assistant to apply a black substance with a wide, flat brush. When it touched Kunta's raw buttocks, the rocketing pain smashed him dizzily to the deck. As he lay with his whole body feeling as if it were on fire, he heard men howling anew in terror, and snapping his head up, he saw several of the Tubob engaged in what could only be preparing the men to be eaten. Several of them, in pairs, were pushing first one chained man and then the next into a kneeling position, where he was held while the third Tubob brushed onto his head a white frothing stuff, and then with a narrow gleaming thing raked the hair off his scalp, leaving blood trickling down across his face. When they reached Kunta and seized him, he screamed and struggled with all his might until a heavy kick in the ribs left him gasping for breath, while the skin of his head numbly felt the frothing and the scraping. Next, the chained men's bodies were oiled until they shone, and then they were made to step into some odd loincloth that had 2 holes the legs went through, and that also covered their private parts. Finally, under the close scrutiny of the chief Tubob, they were chained prostrate along the rails as the sun reached the center of the sky. Kunta lay numbly in a kind of stupor. It came into his mind that when they finally ate his flesh and sucked the bones, his spirit would already have escaped to Allah. He was praying silently when barking shouts from the chief Tubob and his big helper made him open his eyes in time to watch the lesser Tubob dashing up the tall poles. Only this time their grunts, as they strained at the ropes, were mixed with excited shouts and laughter. A moment later, most of the great white sheets slackened and crumpled downward. Kunta's nostrils detected a new smell in the air. Actually, it was a mingling of many smells, most of them strange and unknown to him. Then he thought he heard new sounds in the distance, from across the water. Lying on the deck with his crusty eyes half shut, he couldn't tell from where, but soon the sounds grew closer, and as they did, his fearful whimperings joined those of his mates. As the sounds got louder and louder, so did their praying and gibbering, until finally, in the light wind, Kunta could smell the bodies of many unfamiliar Tubob. Just then the big canoe bumped hard against something solid and unyielding, and it lurched heavily, rocking back and forth until, for the first time since they left Africa 4.5 moons before, it was secured by ropes and fell still. Chained men sat frozen with terror. Kunta's arms were locked around his knees and his eyes were clamped shut, as if he were paralyzed. For as long as he could, he held his breath against the sickening wave of smells, but when something clumped heavily onto the deck, he slit his eyes open and saw 2 new Tubobs stepping down from a wide plank holding a white cloth over their noses. Moving briskly, they shook hands with the chief Tubob, who was now all grins, clearly anxious to please them. Kunta silently begged Allah's forgiveness and mercy as the Tubob began rushing along the rails, unchaining the black men, and gesturing with shouts for them to stand up. When Kunta and his mates clutched at their chains, not wanting to let go of what had become almost a part of their bodies, the whips began to crack, first over their heads, then against their backs. Instantly, amid screams, they let go of the chains and stumbled to their feet. Over the side of the big canoe, down on the dock, Kunta could see dozens of Tubobs stamping, laughing, pointing in their excitement, with dozens more running from all directions to join them. Under the whips, they were driven in a stumbling single file up over the side and down the sloping plank toward the waiting mob. Kunta's knees almost buckled under him as his feet touched the Tubob earth, but other Tubob with cocked whips kept them moving closely alongside the jeering crowd, their masts smell like the blow of a giant fist in Kunta's face. When one black man fell, crying out to Allah, his chains pulled down the men ahead of and behind him. Whips lashed them all back up again as the Tubob crowd screamed in excitement. The impulse to dash and escape surged wildly in Kunta, but the whips kept his chained line moving. They trudged past Tubob, riding in extraordinary 2-wheeled and 4-wheeled vehicles drawn by huge animals that looked a little like donkeys, then past a Tubob throng milling around in some kind of marketplace stacked with colorful piles of what seemed to be fruits and vegetables. Finely clothed Tubob regarded them with expressions of loathing, while more roughly clad Tubob pointed and hooted with enjoyment. One of the latter, he noticed, was a she Tubob, her stringy hair the color of straw, After seeing the hungry way the Toubab on the giant canoe had lusted after black women, he was amazed to see that the Toubab had women of their own. But looking at this specimen, he could understand why they preferred Africans. Kunta darted a glance sideways as they passed a group of Toubab screaming crazily around a flurry of two cocks fighting with each other. And hardly had that din faded behind them when they came upon a shouting crowd leaping this way and that to avoid being bowled over by three Toubab boys as they raced and dove after a squealing, filthy swine that looked shiny with grease. Kunta couldn't believe his eyes. As if lightning had struck him, Kunta then glimpsed two black men who were not from the big canoe, a Mandinka and a Serere. There was no doubt. He jerked his head around to stare as they walked quietly behind a Toubab. He and his mates weren't alone after all in this terrible land. And if these men had been allowed to live, perhaps they too would be spared from the cooking cauldron. Kunta wanted to rush over and embrace them, but he saw their expressionless faces and the fear in their downcast eyes. And then his nose picked their smell. There was something wrong with it. His mind reeled. He couldn't comprehend how black men would docilely follow behind a Toubab who wasn't watching them or even carrying a weapon, rather than try to run away or kill him. He didn't have time to think about it further, for suddenly they found themselves at the open door of a large square house of baked mud bricks in oblong shapes with iron bars set into a few open spaces along the sides. The chained men were whipped inside the wide door by the Toubab guarding it, then into a large room. Kunta's feet felt cool on the floor of hard-packed earth. In the dim light that came through the iron-barred openings, his blinking eyes picked out the forms of 5 black men huddled along one wall. They didn't so much as lift their heads as the Toubab locked the wrists and ankles of Kunta and his mates in thick iron cuffs attached to short chains that were bolted to the walls. Along with the others, Kunta then huddled down himself, with his chin against his clasped knees, his mind dazed and reeling with all that he had seen and heard and smelled since they had gotten off the great canoe. After a little while, another black man entered. Without looking at anyone, he put down some tins of water and food before each man and quickly left. Kunta wasn't hungry, but his throat was so dry that finally he couldn't stop himself from sipping a small amount of water. It tasted strange. Numbly he watched through one of the iron-barred spaces as the daylight faded into darkness. The longer they sat there, the deeper Kunta sank into a kind of nameless terror. He felt that he would almost have preferred the dark hold of the big canoe, for at least he had come to know what to expect next there. He shrank away whenever a Toubab came into the room during the night. Their smell was strange and overpowering, but he was used to the other smells: sweat, urine, dirty bodies, the stink as some chained man went through the agony of relieving his bowels amid the others' mingled praying and cursing and moaning and rattling of their chains. Suddenly all the noises ceased when a Toubab came in carrying a light such as those that had been used on the big canoe, and behind him in the soft yellowish glow another Toubab who was striking with his whip some new black one who was crying out in what sounded like the Toubab tongue. That one was soon chained, and the 2 Toubab left. Kunta and his mates remained still, hearing the newcomers' piteous sounds of suffering and pain. The dawn was near, Kunta sensed, when from somewhere there came into his head as clearly as when he had been in manhood training the high, sharp voice of the Kintango. A man is wise to study and learn from the animals. It was so shocking that Kunta sat bolt upright. Was it finally some message from Allah? What could be the meaning of learning from the animals, here, now? He was himself, if anything, like an animal in a trap. His mind pictured animals he had seen in traps, but sometimes the animals escaped before they were killed. Which ones were they? Finally, the answer came to him. The animals he had known to escape from their traps were those that had not gone raging around within the trap until they were weakened to exhaustion. Those that escaped had made themselves wait quietly, conserving their strength until their captors came, and the animal seized upon their carelessness to explode its energies in a desperate attack, or more wisely, a flight toward freedom. Kunta felt intensely more alert. It was his first positive hope since he had plotted with the others to kill the two-bob on the big canoe. His mind fastened upon it now. Escape. He must appear to the two-bob to be defeated. He must not rage or fight yet. He must seem to have given up any hope. But even if he managed to escape, where would he run? Where could he hide in this strange land? He knew the country around Jafur as he knew his own hut, but here he knew nothing whatever. He didn't even know if two-bob had forests, or if they did, where he would find in them the signs that a hunter would use. Kunta told himself that these problems would simply have to be met as they came. As the first streaks of dawn filtered through the barred windows, Kunta dropped fitfully off to sleep. But no sooner had he closed his eyes, it seemed, than he was awakened by the strange black one bringing containers of water and food. Kunta's stomach was clenched with hunger, but the food smelled sickening, and he turned away. His tongue felt foul and swollen. He tried to swallow the slime that was in his mouth, and his throat hurt with the effort. He looked dully about him at his mates from the big canoe. They all seemed unseeing, unhearing, drawing within themselves. Kunta turned his head to study the 5 who were in the room when they arrived. They wore ragged two-bob clothing. 2 of them were of the light brown Sassoboro skin color that the elders had said resulted from some two-bob taking a black woman. Then Kunta looked at the newcomer who had been brought in during the night. He sat slumped forward, with dried blood caked in his hair and staining the two-bob garment he wore, and one of his arms hung in an awkward way that told Kunta it had been broken. More time passed, and finally Kunta fell asleep again, only to be awakened once more, this time much later by the arrival of another meal. It was some kind of steaming gruel, and it smelled even worse than the last thing they'd set in front of him. He shut his eyes not to see it, but when nearly all of his mates snatched up the containers and began wolfing the stuff down, he figured it might not be so bad after all. If he was ever going to escape from this place, thought Kunta, he would need strength. He would force himself to eat a little bit, but just a little. Seizing the bowl, he kept it to his open mouth and gulped and swallowed until the gruel was gone. Disgusted with himself, he banged the bowl back down and began to gag, but he forced it down again. He had to keep the food inside him if he was going to live. From that day on, 3 times a day, Kunta forced himself to eat the hated food. The black one who brought it came once each day with a bucket, hoe, and a shovel to clean up after them. And once each afternoon, 2 two-bob came to paint more of the stinging black liquid over the men's worst open sores, and sprinkled the yellow powder over the smaller sores. Kunta despised himself for the weakness that made him jerk and moan from the pain along with the others. Through the barred window, Kunta counted finally 6 daylights and 5 nights. The first 4 nights he had heard faintly from somewhere, not far away, the screams of women whom he recognized from the big canoe. He and his mates had had to sit there, burning with humiliation at being helpless to defend their women, let alone themselves. But it was even worse tonight, for there were no cries from the women. What new horror had been visited upon them? Nearly every day, 1 or more of the strange black men in two-bob clothes would be shoved stumbling into the room and chained, slumped against the wall behind them, or curled down on the floor. They always showed signs of recent beatings, seeming not to know where they were or to care what might happen to them next. Then, usually before another day had passed, some important acting Tubob would enter the room holding a rag over his nose, and always one of those recent prisoners would start shrieking with terror, as that Tubob kicked and shouted at him. Then that black one would be taken away. Whenever he felt that each bellyful of food had settled, Quinta would try to make his mind stop thinking in an effort to sleep. Even a few minutes of rest would blot out for that long a time this seemingly unending horror, which for whatever reason was the divine will of Allah. When Quinta couldn't sleep, which was most of the time, he would try to force his mind onto things other than his family or his village, for when he thought of them he would soon be sobbing.